So the title of my sermon, I'll just get it out of the way right at the beginning. The title of my sermon on this holy day is "This is Where I Want to Be." So this is where I want to be. So back in 1964, our parents bought their first house. So it's a small house, I don't know, maybe 1,200 square feet or so, 3 bedrooms and 1 bath. I was just a few months old at that time when we moved into that house. Now, our father, who was always conservative with money, did not want to buy a house. He did not want to have the burden of a mortgage. But our mother, who was baptized in 1961, this story was told more than once, but our mother convinced him that with the church's teachings about 1975 and prophecy, he wouldn't have to pay on that mortgage for too long. And he enjoyed bringing that up after he paid that house off and another house off as well. But I lived in that house that they bought in 1964 for about 20 years. I say about 20 years. It was 20 years. I was 20 years old when I went off to college. So probably in the same bedroom for the vast majority of the 20 years. It's one of those things that seemed unfair when there were 4 boys and 1 girl, and the girl got a room to herself, and the 4 boys got a room with 2 sets of bunk beds. But we survived happily. But since then, since I went away for college when I was 20 years old, I've lived in 10 different states and 2 different countries, and within those various states moved from apartments and houses, and I think we've moved enough and have bought and sold 8 houses that we've lived in, if I'm not mistaken. So we had quite a bit of number of moves. One company that I worked with before I was in the pastoral ministry would move us every 1.5 to 2 years. So they'd want me to take a different job in a different location. And I always like to make this point. I am so happy Valerie always moved with me. Whenever I moved, there was no kicking and screaming. She was happy to do what we were doing. Even in the ministry, I trained 1 year with Larry Neff in Colorado, moved to West Virginia. We were there for 2.5 years, moved to Maryland. And we were in Maryland for 3 years when I got a call from Ministerial Services asking us to consider moving after we were there for 3 years. And that was about the time of 2008. You might remember that there was a housing bubble that took place at that time. And we bought a foreclosed house. And in that area where we were in Maryland, the government had a program that they would pay a good part of your down payment on a house, a foreclosed home, but you had to live there a certain time. So that prevented us from moving after being there for 3 years. And we actually stayed in Maryland for 10 years. And that was the longest that we've lived in any one place since we've been married. Then from Maryland, went to New Zealand. And I think many of you are familiar with our story in that situation, that we ended up in Dallas because we couldn't live in New Zealand. We ended up in Dallas for a period of time, and we've been in Houston now for a year, which is hard to comprehend. We closed on our house in the Houston area. We're in Rosenberg, southwest of Houston. We closed on it on April 20th in 21, so we've been there just a year now. And I know it's not necessarily unusual for people to move. We live in a transient society, and if anyone grew up in a military family or in similar working situations where the companies would move you from place to place, you know what I'm talking about as far as the number of moves that we've been to. And the point that I'm making, that I'm leading up to with this backstory, is that every place we have lived, we have felt at home. Anywhere and everywhere that we have lived, we have felt at home. And I was talking to Valerie about this. I was going through preparing the sermon, that I said, I have it in my notes that we have never felt like vagabonds. I said, but I have to make a correction because with the situation that happened in New Zealand where we were visiting here when COVID-19 started, they closed their borders. I think if our visa was still good, it's expired, but if it was still good, I don't think we could move back even today after being here for over 2 years, 2+ years now. Bumming an apartment and a car and different things and all of our stuff, being in New Zealand for the year and a half while we were living in an FI apartment in Allen, Texas, I guess we did feel a little bit like vagabonds. So now that that's out of the way, any other time, we felt at home any place and every place we have been. But I want to take a little bit of time, since I brought up that term vagabond, to focus on that. What does vagabond mean? As a noun, it refers to a person who wanders from place to place without a home. So if you are ever referred to as a vagabond, that's the idea behind it, that you wander from place to place without any permanent home or any permanent place to be settled. As an adjective, it literally means to be vagabonding, I guess might be the way it's put. As an adjective, it means having no settled home. So it means as an adjective to have no settled home. In other words, to be unsettled, not to be at peace, not to have rest, no security. Now, some people claim to like this sort of lifestyle, a lifestyle where they're not tied down by any responsibilities. Nothing holds them down. They can come, they can go as they please and when they please. Some people refer to it as maybe a gypsy spirit, that they do as they please, when and how they want. They come and go. Let's take a look at this term vagabond in the Bible, because it starts early in Genesis chapter 4. I think you'll recognize it, of course, what took place in Genesis chapter 4. So in Genesis chapter 4, we have the first murder, and we also have the first official vagabond. I was thinking about considering the audience. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with the topic of brothers murdering brothers, but here we go. It shouldn't be a problem for either of us, I'm sure. But after Cain murdered his brother Abel, God proclaimed a curse upon him. So Genesis chapter 4, starting in verse 8. So now Cain talked with Abel, his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and killed him. Then the Eternal said to Cain, "Where is Abel, your brother?" He said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And he said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." In verse 11, "So now you are cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. A fugitive and a vagabond you shall be on the earth." So there's an emphasis here, because it's not just vagabond. The terms that are used, two different terms. You shall be a fugitive and a vagabond. You shall be on the earth. The term or the word for fugitive, it literally means to cause to move constantly, to make unstable, to make to wander, someone who is constantly fleeing. Sometimes it's translated to shake. So if you can picture just about the time that your eyes are closed, you're about to fall asleep, and somebody disturbs your rest. They shake you awake, and it starts to happen every time you start to fall asleep. That's kind of the ideal behind it. A constant moving, to make unstable, to make wander, someone who is constantly fleeing. And then the word for vagabond literally means a wanderer, someone who leads a wandering, unsettled life. A vagabond in the Bible, in the Hebrew, someone who leads an unsettled life. Now we know from Scripture that Abel he's known as righteous Abel. So we see this contrast, righteous Abel and vagabond Cain. So certainly a contrast in the brothers. We could say in this sense that Abel was at home with God. Abel was at home with God. He had a good, stable relationship with God. So how can two walk together unless they agree? Why was he known as righteous Abel? Why do we refer to him as righteous Abel? Well, Abel, from what we can comprehend, did what God instructed him to do. So he had that kind of relationship with God to where he was known as righteous Abel. And we see that Cain decided to do what he wanted to do and how he wanted to do it. And he became a fugitive and a vagabond. So a very short section of scriptures, but we can understand that Abel was striving to obey God, was striving to please God and do things the way God wanted them to do it, the way God instructed them to do it. But that was not Cain's outcome. Let's look at also in Psalm 109. Some time ago, I downloaded one class from Mr. Johnson's class on the general epistles on my phone. I meant to come back and download some more, but I have one. It's class 18 of the general epistles that I downloaded on my phone. So every time I mowed the lawn, after that class came out, I listened to class 18, since it was the only one I had on my phone. And if you've listened to that class, if you remember, during the Q&A section, there's a question. And the first time I heard it, I've heard it 3 or 4 times now, but the first time I heard it, I thought, who would ask that question? So if you're here, give me just a moment and I'll make it up to you. But I thought, who would ask that question? And the question was, is it okay if I pray to God and ask for vengeance on someone? So did you ask anybody here? No. But the first time I heard it, I thought, who would ask that question? So if you're curious about the answer, Mr. Johnson, I think, answers it very clearly and very succinctly, very well. Does a fantastic job with it. But then I heard it again, and I started thinking, wait a minute. What did David do? So here we are in Psalm 109, and we'll look at this, because this was David's prayer for those who oppressed him. In Psalm 109, I have to turn there to read it to you. I'm going to start in verse 1. So I'm going to read a section here to make the point of David's prayer. So Psalm 109, verse 1, do not keep silent, O God of my praise, for the mouth of the wicked and the mouth of the deceitful have opened against me. They have spoken against me with a lying tongue. They have also surrounded me with words of hatred and fought against me without a cause. In return for my love, they are my accusers, but I give myself to prayer. Thus they have rewarded me evil for good and hatred for my love. Set a wicked man over him. Well, here we go. Set a wicked man over him. Let an accuser stand at his right hand. When he is judged, let him be found guilty, and let his prayer become sin. Let his days be few, and let another take his office. Let his children be fatherless, and his wife a widow. Let his children continually be vagabonds and beg. Let them seek their bread also from desolate places. And so he's got some strong words for his enemy in this prayer. So very strong words. Verse 10, let his children continually be vagabonds. So same root word that we read from earlier with a very similar meaning, but it does mean to move about in an unsettled manner, to go about in an unsettled manner without direction and without any final destination. So not knowing where you're going. David must have been pretty upset. He was using strong words. I thought this was interesting. I'm just throwing this out there because it was the first time I've heard of this. But in regards to what I'm talking about right now, have any of you ever heard of the Jewish wanderer or the Jewish vagabond? I had not heard it. I just read it recently in preparing the message. Sometimes reading commentaries, they'll say this is a Jewish tradition or a Jewish legend. But this time it was a Christian legend, and it's believed by some who proclaim to be Christian that a Jewish man who taunted Jesus on the way to the crucifixion, that he taunted Jesus as Christ was going to be crucified. And because of this, God cursed this Jew to live forever, can't die, and to never have a settled place. So a vagabond or a wanderer. I thought that, whoever came up with that obviously doesn't like Jews. But I thought, well, we know it's not true. So just to be clear, I don't believe this, and I don't encourage you to believe it either. But I thought it was interesting that it came up in the regards of biblical wanderings. But does it remind you of anyone or any being? Let's look at Job chapter 1. We'll just read one verse here in Job chapter 1 and verse 7. Job 1 and verse 7, we read, "And the Eternal said to Satan, 'Where do you come from?' So Satan answered the Eternal and said, 'From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it.'" So does Satan sound settled or at rest or at peace? So he comes from going to and fro on the earth and walking back and forth on it. Let's turn to Jude, if you'd turn there with me. I'm going to read starting in verse 4. Jude starts talking about why the brethren at that time that he was writing to, and why we today need to make sure that we are constantly contending for the faith, contending for the truth once delivered. So he's going through that there have been teachers, false teachers who have crept into the church unaware. In other words, they've made themselves somehow prominent in the church and were causing trouble with the different doctrine, the heresy that they were teaching. In verse 4, so Jude, verse 4, "For certain men have crept in unnoticed, who long ago were marked out for this condemnation, ungodly men who turn the grace of our God into lewdness and deny the only Lord God and our Lord Jesus Christ. But I want to remind you, though you once knew this, that the Lord, having saved the people out of the land of Egypt," as we heard in the opening message, "afterward destroyed those who did not believe, and the angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, he has reserved in everlasting chains under the darkness for the judgment of the great day." In verse 7, "As Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, in a similar manner to these, having given themselves over to sexual immorality and gone after strange flesh, are set forth as an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. Likewise, also these dreamers," so he's going through some of the things that they are doing. They defile the flesh, they reject authority, they speak evil of dignitaries. And you might be familiar with the word dignitaries as doxa in the Greek, and it could mean somebody who's placed in an office in the sense of speaking evil of the president or the governor, or something like that. Or it could be offices in the church. It could be even other church members who have God's Spirit. They would be considered dignitaries in this sense. In verse 9, though, it says, "Yet Michael the archangel, in contending with the devil, when he disputed about the body of Moses, dared not bring against him a reviling accusation, but said, 'The Lord rebuke you.' But these people," so they speak evil. These speak evil of whatever they do not know, and whatever they know naturally, like brute beasts, In these things they corrupt themselves. So he's starting to talk about their attitudes, their natures, how they are acting. Woe to them, for they have gone in the way of Cain. So we just talked about that, the way of Cain. Cain rejected what God taught him and decided he was going to do what he wanted to do and how he wanted to do it. And these people have gone in the way of Cain. They have run greedily in the error of Balaam for profit, and they have perished in the rebellion of Korah. So we see this independent attitude, we see this greed, we see rebellion. These are spots in your love feasts, while they feast with you without fear, serving only themselves. So it gets a little tricky here because now Jude is switching from talking about these people who crept in into the church, who somehow gained a certain amount of prominence in the church, and now they're teaching heresy, they're teaching falseness. And he starts talking about evil spirits. It applies to both the people and to the evil spirits. They're clouds without water. They don't have God's Spirit. They're carried about by winds. Start to get an idea about this concept of being fugitives or vagabonds. They're carried about by winds. Late autumn trees without fruit, twice dead, pulled up by the roots. Raging waves of the sea, foaming up their own shame. Wandering stars for whom is reserved the blackness of darkness forever. So we get an idea of the spirit or spirits that's behind the attitudes, the motivations of these false teachers in such a sense or such a way that it does not lead to a settled peace or settled rest. I can't help it every time I read through. It's a very serious section of Scripture with a serious warning. So I don't want to take away from that, but every time I read about love feasts, it reminds me of a number of years ago, buying a house, sitting with the loan officer. And Valerie wasn't working, so we're buying the house with our down payment and my ministerial salary. And he was trying to increase it in any way he could. So he asked me, well, how much do you get in love offerings? And I could tell he felt bad for me when I said, I don't get any love offerings. But we do have love feasts. We do come together with a love for God and a love for the brethren. But notice the seriousness of what Jude is referring to. Carried away by winds. The concept of being tossed to and fro, carried away by winds, pulled up by the roots, raging waves of the sea, wandering stars. So again, the spirit or spirits behind the attitudes and the motivations doesn't lead to peace or settled rest. So the way of Cain, I will do it my way. I do not care what God says. That independent spirit that so many human beings have. So I don't care what God says. Greed, rebellion, unsettled wandering. No rest, no peace, tossed to and fro. So let's put this a little bit, hopefully, as we go forward, into the context of why we're here today. With this holy day, the last day of unleavened bread. So we should all strive to put the context of the holy days, or to put the holy days into the context of God's plan of salvation. And we are here for this last day of unleavened bread. So you probably have been here recently a few times, but let's go back to 1 Corinthians 5. I just want to read a few verses here, verses 6 through 8. So 1 Corinthians 5. First Corinthians 5, verses 6 through 8. So your glorying is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Therefore, purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you are truly unleavened. So I had to stop. I covered this in the first holy day in Kenya, and I had to stop and ask the translator, "How are you translating lump? What does that mean in your language? Does it come across as it's meant?" The translator that was translating is a very good translator, and he was able to change it to dough for bread, basically, is what he was saying. But you may be a new lump since you are truly unleavened. For indeed, Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. Therefore, let us keep the feast not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. And of course, this is a time that we focus on. Here we are in God's church, a part of the body of Jesus Christ, and we live this way. We are to live this way. Strive to live this way with sincerity and truth. And we should, by this point, after maybe years, decades, for many of us, of studying these scriptures, understand leavening represents sin, and just a little can cause a lot of confusion or difficulties and problems in a congregation. Go back to what Jude was talking about. Now, these people came into the congregation and were starting to teach heresy, and there they were, the false teachers that somehow had gained prominence. So just a little can cause a lot of trouble. And I don't know if you do this sometimes when you read through 1 Corinthians and you think, are they really a part of the body of Christ? Are they really a congregation of that we're a part of this? And it reminds me of when back in 2010 when we went through the last split, and we were having meetings. We were in Louisville, Kentucky, if I remember correctly. I think that's where we were. And we were having meetings with the ministry, and the question came up if the local elders and the members in the various congregations could kind of vote on who would be their pastor. And I believe the person was sincere. I don't remember who asked it, but I believe they were sincere, and they're talking through things. But as I have a tendency to do sometimes, to say things before I stop myself, I said, well, can pastors choose church members? Because if we could, I would not choose these people in 1 Corinthians. Maybe in 2 Corinthians, but these people in 1 Corinthians, I would leave them for Mr. Black. He can handle the challenge, but that's not what I'm thinking I would like to choose. But Paul's very direct. And we want to observe this time, and not with malice and wickedness. Now, two words that are very similar. There's some difference. There's some emphasis on this because they're back to back, just like fugitive and vagabond. So not with malice and wickedness, a way of living in sin. So the motivations, the drives, the attitudes, the spirit or the spirits behind it. Malice and wickedness versus sincerity and truth. That malice and wickedness is part of it is the idea of taking whatever is good and somehow perverting it, twisting it and perverting what is good. So we see then this malice and wickedness that causes chaos and confusion, and causes people to be unsettled, causes people to be tossed to and fro without roots, always seeking for self and never finding that peace or that rest, never finding that satisfaction. Let's focus for a moment on the word truth. So sincerity and truth. John 8:31 and 32. So we recognize that we have the foundation of truth to anchor ourselves to. It is eternal truth. John 8:31 and 32. John 8:31, then Jesus said to those Jews who believed him, if you abide in my word, you are my disciples indeed. And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. So we understand the concept that all of us are slaves. All of us are slaves. We are either slaves of sin or slaves of Jesus Christ. We are told to take the yoke of Jesus Christ. And that connotates that we submit to Jesus Christ, that we're going to allow Christ to live in us and through us. So Christ said, take my yoke. And it gives us, then when we're grounded in the truth, it gives us that anchor so we're not tossed to and fro. We start to become settled. We start to become at peace and at rest. So we have this freedom from being tossed by every wind of doctrine because we hold on to the truth. And Jesus said in verse 31, if you abide in my word, to abide, it literally means to live or to dwell with, but it means to settle into. It can be translated that way, to settle into the truth. If you abide in my word. So we have the Passover. Death has passed over us. We're granted salvation. We're granted life, a future in God's family. And we're granted the days of unleavened bread where we understand we are coming out of the world. We're coming out of this age of disobedience that is so full of confusion and chaos and calamity. A society that is not settled. We see it all around us, the hate, the violence that is all around us. And so we come out of that to abide in truth and have stability and have the ability, the opportunity to be settled, to be at rest, to be at peace. John 17, scriptures we read at Passover. In John 17, I'm going to read verse 6 to start off. John 17, verse 6, I have manifested your name to the men whom you have given me out of the world. They were yours. You gave them to me, and they have kept your word. Verse 9, I pray for them. I do not pray for the world, but for those whom you have given me, for they are yours. Verse 11, now I am no longer in the world, but these are in the world, and I come to you, Holy Father. Keep through your name those whom you have given me, that they may be one as we are. So we heard in the opening message that in the world, there are things going on. There is temptation, there is confusion, there is constant, that pull that we're fighting against. So it is going all around us. And Christ says, these are in the world. And we know we are told to come out of the world, but we understand the concept. So the world continues as from the time of Adam and Eve when they rejected God, and the time of Cain, unsettled, disruptive, anger, hate, violence. Sometimes even God's people can get caught up in it. Look at what happened to righteous Abel. Righteous Abel. And his brother kills him. Look at what happened to Stephen. Sometimes God's people get caught up in it. But God's calling gives us peace and a settled rest on the stability so that no matter what's going on, we have that opportunity to be anchored to the truth. Verse 14, I have given them your word, and the world has hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. I do not pray that you should take them out of the world, but that you should keep them from the evil one, who's going back and forth, to and fro upon the earth. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Sanctify them. We know it means set them apart by your truth. Your word is truth. So God's calling and the understanding of truth gives us peace. John chapter 10. I want to read a few scriptures here in John chapter 10, starting in verse 24. So we start off in verse 24 with the Jews who have surrounded Jesus Christ, and they're asking him these questions. John chapter 10, verse 24, then the Jews surrounded him and said to him, how long do you keep us in doubt? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly. Jesus answered them, I told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name, they bear witness of me. But you do not believe because you are not of my sheep, as I said to you. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. And I give them eternal life, and they shall never perish. Neither shall anyone snatch them out of my hand. So my Father, who has given them to me, is greater than all, and no one is able to snatch them out of my Father's hand. And so we read these verses, and we can understand that we are in the hands of God. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. I've learned over the years that I think I give a sermon on a topic, and everyone's going to remember it. So I gave a sermon on that over a year ago, so I'm sure if you heard it, you remember it, and we can skip past going into any more detail on that at this time. But the point I wanted to make by reading that is that we're in God's hands, and that should always give us peace and a sense of being at rest and a sense of being settled peace. So I'm going to start wrapping up here a little bit by talking a little about Psalm 23. So I'm not going to read the psalm, but I do want to just talk about it a little bit. It's probably one of the most, if not the most famous psalm in the book of Psalms, Psalm 23. There's hymns. We have at least 3 in our own hymnal that are based on this psalm. There's poems. Probably some of you, anyway, would recognize there's a rap song, and even Weird Al Yankovic has done a parody of this psalm. I'm not going to sing anything from Weird Al Yankovic, but it's a famous psalm, probably the most famous psalm. And the connotation behind it, the theme behind all of this is stability and peace and joy and happiness and contentment, no matter what is going on around us, or no matter what we are going through. It allows us this. And I'm going to read a little bit from Barnes's notes of the Bible here on Psalm 23, where he says, quote, the psalm has always been regarded as one of exquisite beauty. The main subject is the watchful care which God has extended over the writer, and the consequent assurance which he felt that God would still watch over him and supply all his need. So the leading thought, the essential idea is his full belief that God would provide for him and that he would never be left to want. This is the thought with which the psalm commences. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And this thought is carried through the psalm, and it's illustrated by these facts or images that God was his shepherd, and he had always manifested toward him the care which a shepherd takes of his flock, and that he had prepared a table before him in the very presence of his enemy. In other words, that he had abundantly provided for him, even in the very sight of his enemies, and when they were endeavoring to destroy him, thus giving him the assurance that he would never leave him, that God would never leave him. So there's assurance and there's confidence in this relationship with God that we have through the truth. And no matter where I live in this physical world, this is where I want to be. So in the opening message, there was a reading of a psalm or a song, at least the chorus or verse. So I want to read Psalm 31 or hymn 31. This is a version from Psalm 23. So I'm not reading the psalm itself, but I do want to read from this hymn as I conclude, where it says, my shepherd will supply my need. Eternal is his name. In pastures fresh he makes me feed beside the living stream. He brings my wandering spirit back when I forsake his ways, and leads me for his mercy's sake in path of truth and grace. When I walk through the shades of death, thy presence is my stay. One word of thy supporting breath drives all my fears away. Thy hand and sight of all my foes doth still my table spread. My cup with blessings overflows. Thine oil anoints my head. So the sure provisions of my God attend me all my days. O may thy house be my abode, and all my work be praise. There would I find a settled rest, while others go and come. No more a stranger nor a guest, but like a child at home. This is where I want to be.